What's going on, guys? Welcome back to DCS World. Welcome back aboard the Hornet for another tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at the radar. The Hornet is equipped with the APG-73 air-to-air pulse Doppler radar, and it is a pretty advanced yet fairly simple to use radar once you get your head around some of the symbology out there. The radar itself is located in the nose of our airplane, pointing out into the air in front of us, looking in a cone that sort of sweeps back and forth across the sky, sort of to where my camera is looking. So it's going to go from here to here and back. It's going to do that in a back and forth pattern, following a bar scan pattern, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. So in order to actually view the radar, let's go over here and look at our right side DDI, and I'm going to halt my camera there. To access the radar screen from our TAC page of our DDI, we want to select RDR Attack, that stands for Radar Attack Format, and it brings up this screen. This is a top-down, what's called B-scope representation of what the radar sees. Now you'll notice that it's showing us a big square of the airspace in front of us, but as I mentioned before, the radar actually sees in the shape of a cone in front of us. And you can already see some contacts out there. Contacts on the radar are represented by these little bricks that float around, and we will manipulate those shortly. Now, I mentioned before that the radar scans in what's called a bar scan pattern, which means it's going to scan at a certain elevation, it's going to drop down to a certain elevation, and then it's going to scan back and then go back up to that elevation. It's going to scan that level of bar, and then that actually allows the radar to see more of the airspace in front of it. The radar's antenna beam, the actual radar beam represented by this sweeping line going back and forth on the screen here, is actually a fairly narrow beam. It's only a couple of degrees that it alone can see. So what we do is we widen the bar scan so that it enables it to sweep a wider area and give us more information. In addition, we can also manipulate the overall elevation of the antenna, but I'll explain what that does in just a little bit. For right now, let's take a look at some of the symbology that we have on the radar screen. We have the main radar mode here listed in the corner. RWS stands for Range While Search. This is the default and currently the only mode available for the Hornet's radar. There will be a Track While Scan mode coming a little bit later, which will enable us to track and launch weapons against multiple targets. However, at this stage of early access for the Hornet, TWS is not available, and indeed when TWS is available, I'll be certain to do a full video on it because there will be some contingencies and things to talk about there. Going down the side, we have surface mode, which is a air-to-ground mode for the radar, which is currently not implemented, so we're not going to worry about it just yet. We can go back to air mode. Radar primary, this is just saying it's our primary sensor. Next below that is our PRF, Pulse Repetition Frequency. This is, for a real layman's explanation, is how much the radar beam is pulsing. You know, literally as it says, pulse repetition frequency, how fast it's pulsing, and it can have three modes. We can have pulse repetition frequency medium, which means the radar pulses at a slightly slower frequency, and this is useful for targets that are moving away from us. We can have pulse repetition frequency high, which enables us to better see targets that are flying towards us. And then we have an interleaved mode, denoted by INTL here, where it switches between high and medium for each sweep of the radar beam, and that gives us the most coverage that we probably will reasonably want. In the bottom corner here, we also see the symbol here for BRA, bearing range and altitude. This is just saying that our radar cursor, which you can see me moving around here using the TDC, throttle designator controller, that's just giving us a bearing range and altitude. to wherever our radar cursor is. So at this point in space here, that is at a bearing of 051 for 11.6-ish miles or so. And if I were to point it at one of the targets, he's at 097 for 20.5 or so thereabouts. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Mode button here does nothing. That would switch between the main radar modes. We also have the azimuth scan width. Right now, the setting here is set to 140 degrees. That means that the scanner sweep is going in a 140 degree cone in front of us. We can narrow this down. It's got settings of as narrow as 20 degrees. Notice how the beam is now much narrower. 40 is a little wider, 60, 80, and then back up to 140. Channel function is not implemented. Don't worry about it just yet. On the data page, if we open this up, there's a few options here. We can turn off the bra symbology if we want to. Don't know why you would. It's very useful to leave on. We have some declutter modes here. By default, it's in declutter mode 2. We turn that off. We actually get a horizon line and our path vector, so we can go fully heads down in the display here, so we can actually fly the aircraft from this screen. So very useful. And if we don't go back to declutter 1 and indeed declutter 2 are the same. Just turn declutter off if you want that symbology. LTWS stands for Latent Track While Scan. I will explain what LTWS is in a future video when we talk about some of the more advanced sensor functions such as MSI. Right above that there, multi-sensor integration. We're leaving that off for now just to keep things simple. And of course we can change the color mode of the display. The DDIs are of course 3-color displays. With color off, our target box turns green with the rest of the display. And if we turn color back on, our target box turns yellow. That's basically all that does. The raid look functions are not implemented, so don't worry about them yet. And that's pretty much it for the data display. Let's close that down here and take a look at a few more things. We can change the range of this display here with these options in the upper right corner. Currently we see out to about 40 miles. And if we use the up and down arrows, I could extend this out to 80 and a maximum of 160 miles. Nautical miles, that is. Let's bring it back down to 40 for now. We can go as close as 5 nautical miles. Notice how when I change these ranges, these scan ranges, the hash marks around the outside of the display sometimes can change. And this is helpful because it tells you a sort of split of where targets might be based on how they're broken down from their range. So if this is set to 40 miles would be the top of the display. The next hash mark down would be 30, 20, 10, and then 0, of course. And those denominations are also roughly the same for the different scan modes. For 80, for example, we go 80, 60, 40, 20, and then 0. So on and so forth. For 5 miles, it's a little bit different because we're so close. It would go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. Let's set that back to 40. Now, to actually use the radar and lock things up with the radar, we use, as I mentioned before, our TDC, throttle designator controller, so the slew stick on your throttle. We move that around, and we can move our radar cursor around. One thing I forgot to mention is we need to make sure that the TDC is actually assigned to our DDI, and we know it's assigned if we have the diamond here. If the TDC wasn't assigned, and for example, that diamond was gone, I try to move my TDC around, and I'm not moving that cursor. So we need to go sensor select switch, in this case sensor select switch right. There we go. We've got the diamond, and now our TDC is assigned to this DDI, and we can move our cursor around. Now I've got some contacts out here roughly, 20 to 30 miles in front of us here. If I move my cursor over one of them and just hover the cursor, we get some symbology here. I can see that that target there is currently at Mach 1.1 is his speed. His speed is displayed on the left. His altitude in thousands of feet is displayed on the right of the contact. So that particular contact is at Mach 1.2 now, speeding up, and he is at 23,000 feet or thereabouts. If I move over and I look at another one, you see similar symbology there as well. Don't worry about the fact that the targets are changing from yellow to red. That has to do with the IFF functions, and we'll cover that in a later video. Red does mean bad guy, by the way. Now, let's say we wanted to lock one of these targets up. We would hover our cursor over one of these targets, and then we would do TDC depress, and one press of TDC puts it into a sort of soft lock. This goes into what's called a latent track while scan lock, and again, I will go into latent track while scan later. However, for our purposes today, we're actually going to double click on TDC, so let's go click and click. We've now put this target into what's called a STT, or single target track. That means that our radar beam is now squarely focused on that target and that target alone, and we are only tracking him. Notice that all of the other targets have disappeared from our display, and we are now only looking at this guy. And we got some new information. As before, we see his speed in Mach. He's currently 0.8, 0.9 Mach or thereabouts, and he's showing at 28,000 feet. Now, if we wanted to unlock this target, we would use our undesignate button, nose wheel steering / undesignate, and now we're back in the radar mode that we were before. And we can see our contact bricks floating around out there. Now, you might be wondering what those numbers above and below the target cursor actually are. Those represent the minimum and maximum altitudes that our current bar scan settings actually show us. So right now, with the current settings that I have, looking at this exact spot, our radar sees between 24,000 and 26,000 feet, so the lower and the upper limits of the bar scan. If I were to go from this option up here, change it from a 2-bar scan to a 4-bar scan, and let's move the cursor up here just to make it a little bit more apparent, we now see a range of about 19,000 feet all the way up to 31,000 feet. Okay? And this is important because we don't necessarily always know what altitude the targets are going to be at, so it's helpful to widen the scan to help us find those targets. Now, you do have to be careful, though, because the radar beam can only see essentially one bar at a time as it's sweeping across, so you might have noticed that some targets have already fallen off of the radar display. That's pretty normal for something like a 4-bar scan, because the radar beam is not always going to see those targets. So for our purposes, let's go back up here and change this back from 4-bar down to, it can go up to 6-bar, by the way. It can go as low as 1 bar. I like to use a 2-bar scan, and it changed our, when we lock that one target up, it changed our range. So let's go back to 40, and then we see these targets out here in the distance. Now, one thing we can also do with the radar antenna is change its elevation. Look on the left side of the radar display. We see this little caret here that's sort of bouncing up and down. This is representative of the actual elevation of our radar antenna. Right now, it's roughly level with the horizon, as denoted by the fact that it is right in the middle. However, if we use our radar antenna elevation control, I can slide it up. Notice that caret has moved up. Notice also that all of those targets on our screen have now just disappeared. The reason for that is because we're now aiming the antenna up. You'll also notice on our target designator cursor here, our minimum and maximum altitudes are now pointing way up into the sky, 60,000 to 65,000 feet. Our radar is not seeing anything up there, so we're not displaying any contacts. If we want to see those contacts, we need to then move our radar elevation back down to roughly about the center, since I'm co-altitude with these guys, and then boom, all of those contacts come back. There will be cases where you'll need to slew the radar antenna up or down to try to find your targets based on information you might get from, say, an AWACS or other ships saying where targets might be, because again, the radar doesn't really see everything. In fact, it sees very little. You have to point it roughly in the right direction to get it to see anything. Alright guys, that's the real basics, and when I say basics, I truly mean basics. I could spend hours talking about some of the different functions of the radar and how to use it, but we'll explore more when we actually get into employing things like radar-guided missiles, AMRAAMs and Sparrows and things of that nature, and when we get into more advanced functions such as IFF, MSI, data link, SA page, all of that good stuff. But for now, I hope that gets you started on using the radar. I'm actually linking again to Chuck's guide in the description of this video. His guide has a pretty good write-up on the intricacies of the radar, so check that out. Get out there with some targets and practice locking them, practice unlocking them, moving the antenna around and changing your bar scan, and changing your range and all of the different settings just to see what they do, and we will see you for the next video. Take care.